Hi, and welcome back. I'm glad you're with me again, because in this session, we're going to learn how to have a life-saving conversation. I'll give you some of the do's and don'ts of talking with a loved one who is depressed or maybe suicidal. So let's talk about what not to say first. Suppose a loved one says, "I wish I were dead," or "I can't go on." How should you respond? First, resist the temptation to downplay or discount their words. Instead of saying, "You don't really mean that," pause and tune in. They're asking to be heard. We live in a world of shallowness and pretense. When history looks back on us, they'll marvel that we were the generation that smiled for a selfie right before we jumped off the bridge. When it comes to suicide, it's time to get real. In addition to "you don't really mean that," try to avoid phrases like "don't talk that way" or "you shouldn't say that." Even if what your loved one says is painful to hear, your goal should be to learn how they're really doing. Be prepared to listen quietly. Bring a handkerchief and hand it to them, and make sure you bring one for yourself. Remember, this isn't about you or your comfort level. It's about them. Another response to avoid is, "everything's going to be okay." If someone is depressed or thinking about suicide, by definition, things are not okay. If the person begins to cry, let them. Resist the temptation to hush them or tell them that everything's going to be all right. Also, never agree to keep someone's suicide plans secret. Getting help for your loved ones is the beginning of their road back to life and recovery, and that can't happen if you stay quiet. Lastly, if someone is struggling to stay alive, telling them that they need to pray more or spend more time reading scripture may be counterproductive. While this may be true, there's another way to go at this. If your loved one is depressed, they may have a difficult time praying or concentrating. And actually, prayer and concentration can be difficult even in the best of times. Instead of telling them to pray more, ask if it would be okay if you pray with them or you read scripture to them aloud. I've noticed a reluctance to talk about suicide and other mental health issues in church. But as followers of Christ, we're supposed to get our lead from Him. In Jesus' ministry of healing, He made absolutely no distinction between mental and physical illness. Actually, that's not even quite true. Remember the incident of Jesus healing the possessed man in Gerasenes? In fact, Jesus, the kosher rabbi, went out of his way to a stinking pig farm to rescue that man from mental illness. In the Hope Always book, I have 2 chapters on mental illness, which you can use as a reference if you want to learn more about this subject or how to screen for depression. God is well aware that you and I are subject to the blues. The author of Psalm 22 says, "I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. Thou hast brought me into the dust of death." The author of Psalm 88 pens a lament of depression aimed at God, in which he says he's stumbling about like the walking dead. The avoidance of depression and suicide by the modern feel-good all-the-time church bears no resemblance to the Bible or the life of Christ. Almost everyone is reluctant to begin a conversation about suicide. And one of the universal fears is that it might actually make somebody consider suicide who wasn't thinking about it in the first place. Well, let me reassure you, this has been studied over and over again. Asking someone about suicide lowers the risk of it happening. Saying nothing is like pushing them away. Asking is like throwing them a lifeline. When it comes to communicating and asking very hard things, I found that it's helpful to have a script memorized that I don't vary from. Having a script doesn't mean you care any less. It means you care enough to be prepared. Pick a quiet place if you can, and then ask, Have you thought about hurting yourself? At some level, every person knows that committing suicide is wrong. I think that most want to be asked whether they're thinking about it. They want to share the burden. Most want to be stopped. You'd be surprised how forthcoming folks are when you ask about their thoughts on suicide. If someone says they have considered suicide, ask if they have a plan. If they have a plan and the means to carry it through, you must act immediately. This is the time to call 911 and say that you're sitting with someone who is suicidal and has a plan. If it's appropriate and you're certain that you and they will be safe, you can take them to the emergency department yourself. Now, this is an uncomfortable subject, but when asking about a plan, you need to ask also about the means of committing suicide. If someone's plan is to shoot themselves, get the firearms out of their house. If they plan to overdose, get rid of the pills. Leave them just a day or two supply of those medicines that they must take. You'd be surprised how many people, even trained professionals, forget this step. Ask how they plan to kill themselves, and then, as soon as possible, remove the means to do so. On the other hand, if the person you're concerned about has no suicidal plans or thoughts, but they are depressed, it's still a good idea to bring up what they should do if they become suicidal. Situations change. Leave the door open for someone to get back to you or someone else if they do become suicidal. Make sure that they have a number to call and that it's written down or in their phone, whether it's as simple as writing down 911 or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-TALK or 8255. Before we close this session, I want to offer you a simple tool that my wife and I used when our kids were little and they were getting bent out of shape. We trained our children to stop and do a systems check. To help them remember, we taught them the acronym HALT, H-A-L-T. Were they hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, i.e. HALT, H-A-L-T. Learning to pause and identify the underlying root of the problem helped our children take a deep breath and identify solutions. If you're hungry, get something to eat. If you're angry, take a walk, take some deep breaths, listen to music. If you're lonely, call a friend. If you're tired, take a nap. Healthy sleep hygiene is incredibly helpful, but often overlooked tool for preventing suicide. For years, I worked 24-hour shifts. At the end of a shift, I could still take care of sick patients, but that was it. If people pressed me for an answer on anything other than patient care, I learned to say, that's going to have to wait until after I've slept, showered, shaved, and eaten. We can all fall into despair, but sometimes the solution is as simple as meeting our basic needs. So let me pause here and offer some practical advice. No matter what age you are, if you haven't learned to do a HALT systems check, start now. Likewise, if you're a parent, church leader, or friend, teaching others to HALT, especially before making any consequential decisions, can be a great gift. So many of our regrettable actions, including suicide, take place when we're under one or more of these four stresses. There's an old proverb in medicine that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Suicide is the one disease for which prevention is the only cure. Jesus made no distinction between healing physical and mental diseases. As our brothers and our sisters' keeper, we're called to follow Christ's example and do likewise. Time and time again, Jesus told his followers that he came so that they might have life and have it more abundantly. It's time for you and me to get Christ's message of hope out to those who need it most. So, to sum up, first, initiating a conversation about suicide is hard, but helpful. It will not make suicide more likely to happen. Second, having a script memorized to open up your conversation is wise. It means you care enough to be prepared. Third, if someone has a suicide plan and the means to do it, you must get help immediately. And lastly, whenever you or someone you love is getting bent out of shape, use the systems check HALT. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. It might just save a life. In our next session, we're going to learn more about how to prevent depression, how to maintain hope, and specific things that have sustained others through very hard times. I hope you'll join me.